In the winter of 1879, a broken man searching for his stolen cattle discovered a Lakota woman crouched like a wounded wolf in a hidden canyon, clutching a blood-stained knife and whispering prayers to spirits he couldn't name. What Solomon Wade didn't know was that saving her life would drag him into a war between two worlds, where the past never stays buried and some debts can only be paid in blood. The wind carved through Devil's Canyon like a blade-seeking bone, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, something that made Solomon Wade's weathered hands tighten on his rifle. At 44, he had learned to trust his instincts more than his eyes, and right now every instinct screamed danger. The tracks he'd been following for 3 days told a story written in mud and desperation. His cattle, 23 head of prime beef, had been driven hard through terrain that would break most horses. But these weren't ordinary rustlers.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Solomon paused at the canyon's rim, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Below him, the rocky walls narrowed into shadows that seemed to swallow light. His ranch lay 18 miles behind him, a collection of weathered buildings that had once echoed with laughter, but now stood as silent monuments to loss. Rebecca had been dead 3 years, taken by cholera that swept through the territory like wildfire. Their daughter, barely 5 years old, had followed her mother within a week. The graves behind the house marked more than the end of his family. They marked the end of the man he used to be. The cattle tracks led into the canyon's mouth, but something was wrong. Solomon knelt and studied the prints more carefully. The hoof marks were uneven, panicked. Whatever had driven his livestock through here had done so in haste, without care for the animal's welfare. He'd seen rustlers work before, and they were usually careful with stolen stock. Damaged cattle meant less money. This felt different. This felt like someone running for their life. A sound echoed from the canyon depths, barely audible above the wind, not cattle lowing, something else, something human. Solomon's grip on his Winchester tightened as he began his descent down the narrow trail that wound between towering sandstone walls. The path was treacherous, carved by flash floods, and time littered with loose stones that could send a man tumbling to his death. But Solomon had spent the better part of 2 decades in this country. He knew its moods, its dangers, its secrets. The deeper he went, the more the world above seemed to fade away. The canyon walls rose like cathedral spires on either side, painted in layers of red and gold that spoke of ages beyond human memory. But it was what lay ahead that made Solomon's blood run cold. The cattle tracks ended abruptly in a wide clearing where the canyon floor was stained dark with blood. Too much blood for a simple butchering. This was the site of a massacre. Carcasses lay scattered across the rocky ground, but they weren't his cattle. These were horses, war ponies painted with symbols Solomon recognized but wished he didn't. Lakota. The arrows protruding from their flanks bore the markings of the 7th Cavalry. His stomach churned as he counted the bodies. 12 horses, all shot multiple times. This wasn't a battle. This was an execution. But where were the riders? The sound came again, clearer now. A low keening, like wind through broken glass, but unmistakably human. Solomon followed the sound deeper into the canyon, past the killing ground, past scattered weapons and torn clothing that painted a picture he didn't want to see. The trail of blood led to a narrow cleft in the rock wall, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Solomon hesitated. Every rational part of his mind told him to turn back, to ride home and pretend he'd never found this place. But the sound came again, weaker now, and something in it reminded him of Rebecca calling his name in her final hours. He couldn't walk away from that sound. Not again. The cleft opened into a hidden chamber, a pocket in the rock where ancient waters had carved out a sanctuary. Filtered sunlight fell through cracks in the stone ceiling, illuminating a scene that would haunt Solomon for the rest of his days. A young Lakota woman sat against the far wall, her deerskin dress torn and bloody, her long black hair matted with dirt and worse things. In her hands she clutched a knife, its blade dark with blood that wasn't all her own. She looked up as Solomon emerged from the cleft, and he saw in her eyes the same wild desperation he'd seen in trapped animals. But there was something else there too. Intelligence. Calculation. This wasn't some helpless victim. This was a warrior wounded but far from defeated. "Stay back," she said in heavily accented English, raising the knife with hands that shook from exhaustion but not fear. "I will not go with you." Solomon stopped, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Easy now," he said, his voice as gentle as he could make it. "I'm not here to hurt you. My name's Solomon Wade. I'm looking for my cattle." She studied him with dark eyes that seemed to see through his skin to the man beneath. "You are not cavalry," she said, and it wasn't a question. "No, ma'am, just a rancher. Got my beef stolen. Been tracking them for days." He gestured toward the hidden chamber's entrance. "Found a lot more than I bargained for out there." The woman's grip on the knife loosened slightly, but she didn't lower it. "They came at dawn," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Riding hard from the fort. We were traveling to the winter camp, my people and I, the soldiers. They said we were raiders. They said we had stolen horses." Solomon felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How many of you were there?" 15. The word came out like a death sentence. 15 souls. Now only one. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications Solomon didn't want to face. The Lakota had been promised safe passage to the reservations. The wars were supposed to be over, but here was evidence that some men in blue uniforms didn't much care about treaties or promises. "What's your name?" Solomon asked, slowly lowering himself to sit cross-legged on the stone floor, making himself less threatening. She watched him carefully before answering. "Nahimana. That's a pretty name." "What's it mean?" "Mystic. Secret keeper." A bitter smile crossed her bloodied lips. "My grandmother said I was born to guard the sacred things. I think she would be disappointed." Solomon shook his head. "You're alive, that's not nothing. That's everything." Nahimana's eyes flashed with something between anger and grief. "I live while my family feeds the ravens. While my brother lies scalped like an animal. While my cousin's children will never see another summer. You call this everything?" "I call it a chance," Solomon said quietly. "A chance to make their deaths mean something. But first, we need to get you out of here. You're hurt." For the first time, Nahimana looked down at herself, as if just remembering her wounds. Blood seeped through tears in her dress, and her left arm hung at an odd angle. "A bullet," she said matter-of-factly. "It went through. I have bound it, but double quotes. But you need proper doctoring. My ranch isn't far. I've got supplies, clean water, food." Solomon paused, knowing his next words would determine whether she trusted him or tried to kill him. "I've got a safe place where no one will look for you." Nahimana studied his face for a long moment. "Why would you help me?" "Your people and mine. We are enemies now." Solomon thought of Rebecca's grave, of the daughter who would never grow up, of all the emptiness that had filled his life since they died. "Maybe because I know what it's like to lose everything. Maybe because what happened here wasn't war, it was murder. Or maybe because it's the right thing to do." He met her eyes. "Does the reason matter?" "It matters," Nahimana said softly. "In my world, everything matters. Every choice, every word, every breath. They all have consequences that ripple through the sacred web that connects all things." She was quiet for a moment, then slowly lowered the knife. "The soldiers, they took our horses, our weapons, our winter supplies, but they did not find what they were truly looking for." "What's that?" Nahimana's hand moved to touch something hidden beneath her torn dress.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Something that was stolen from them first. Something they would kill every Lakota on the plains to get back. Solomon felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. What are you talking about? The reason they hunted us. The reason they murdered. Children. The reason they will never stop looking for me. Nehemiah's voice dropped to barely audible. I carry proof of what Colonel Marcus Devereaux has been doing. Proof that would destroy him and every man who follows his orders. The name hit Solomon like a physical blow. Colonel Devereaux was a decorated war hero, the scourge of hostile tribes, the man the newspapers called the Hammer of the Plains. If what this woman said was true ... a bull quotes, what kind of proof? Nehemiah's eyes hardened. The kind that turns heroes into criminals. The kind that starts wars or ends them. She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. The kind that makes a man hunt. One wounded woman across 1,000 miles of wilderness. Solomon stood as well, his mind racing. This changes things. If Devereaux's involved, then helping me will make you an enemy of the United States Army, Nehemiah finished. You will be hunted. You will be branded a traitor. You may die for it. Solomon looked at this broken, bloodied woman who somehow still radiated fierce dignity. Despite everything she'd endured, he thought of Rebecca, of the promises he'd made to be a better man than the world demanded. He thought of the graves behind his house and the emptiness that had consumed him for 3 long years. Lady, he said, extending his hand toward her, I've been dead for a long time already. Maybe it's time I started living again. Nehemiah stared at his outstretched hand for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. Then slowly she reached out and took it. Her grip was firm despite her injuries, and Solomon felt something pass between them in that moment. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. 2 souls who had lost everything, finding in each other something worth fighting for. There is something you must know, Nehemiah said, as Solomon helped her toward the hidden chamber's entrance. The soldiers. Who did this? They were not acting alone. Someone very powerful wants what I carry. Someone who will not stop until I am dead and buried. Then we better make sure that doesn't happen, Solomon replied as they emerged from the cleft into the coven. Main Canyon, the site of the massacre hit them both anew. But this time, Solomon saw it through different eyes. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a declaration of war against everything decent people should stand for. And whether he'd wanted it or not, he was now a soldier in that war. My horse is at the rim, Solomon said. Can you make the climb? Nehemiah nodded grimly. I will make it. I have made harder journeys. As they began the treacherous ascent out of Devil's Canyon, neither of them spoke of the danger that lay ahead. Neither mentioned the army that would soon be hunting them or the powerful enemies they had made. Instead, they climbed in silence. 2 damaged souls beginning a journey that would test everything they believed about justice, loyalty, and the courage it takes to do what's right when the whole world tells you you're wrong. The climb was brutal. Nehemiah's wounded arm made her clumsy, and twice Solomon had to catch her when loose stones gave way beneath her feet. But she never complained, never asked him to slow down. Her breathing was labored, her face pale beneath the grime and blood. But her eyes remained focused on the rim above. This was a woman who had survived things that would have broken lesser souls. Halfway up, they found Solomon's cattle. Or what was left of them. The animals had been driven over a narrow ledge, their broken bodies scattered on the rocks below like discarded toys. It was senseless slaughter, the kind of waste that spoke to panic rather than planning. Someone had been in a terrible hurry to cover their tracks. They used your cattle as bait, Nehemiah observed, pausing to catch her breath. They knew you would follow. Solomon felt his jaw clench. Meaning they knew about me specifically? Meaning someone has been watching your ranch? Someone who knows you well enough to predict your actions. She looked at him with those penetrating, dark eyes. The question is why? What makes one lonely rancher important enough to use as a pawn? The implication sent a chill down Solomon's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. His isolation, which he'd always considered protection, might have made him a target instead. A convenient scapegoat, perhaps, or simply a man whose disappearance wouldn't raise too many questions. They reached the rim as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. Solomon's horse, a sturdy buckskin named Jeremiah, waited patiently where he'd been tied, but the animal's ears were pricked forward, alert to some danger Solomon couldn't yet perceive. "We need to move," Nahumana said urgently. "The ravens will bring other scavengers, and not all of them will have 4 legs." Solomon helped her into the saddle, then swung up behind her. She stiffened at the contact, every muscle in her body coiled for fight or flight. Trust, Solomon realized, would not come easily to someone who had watched her entire family butchered by men in uniform. "My ranch is due east," he said quietly. "About 4 hours' ride if we push. Can you hold on that?" "Long?" "I can hold on as long as necessary," she replied. But Solomon noticed how her hands trembled as she gripped the saddle horn. They rode in silence through the gathering dusk, following game trails and creek beds, staying away from the main roads, where cavalry patrols might be waiting. The country here was wild and broken, a maze of canyons and mesas that could hide an army or swallow a man without a trace. It was beautiful in its harshness, but tonight it felt malevolent, full of shadows that might conceal enemies. As they crested a low ridge, Nahumana suddenly stiffened. "Stop," she whispered. Solomon reined in Jeremiah, listening. In the distance, barely audible, came the sound of many horses moving at a steady pace, too organized to be wild mustangs, too numerous to be a small patrol. "How many?" Solomon asked. Nahumana closed her eyes, tilting her head like a wolf scenting the wind. 20, maybe more, moving fast but not racing. They are hunting, but they do not yet know what they hunt. Devereaux's men? Perhaps, or perhaps something worse. She turned to look at him, and in the fading light her face was grave. "There are others who want what I carry. Others who would see the colonel's secrets buried with my bones." Solomon felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical thing. He could still turn back. Could claim he'd never found anything in Devil's Canyon but dead cattle and bad memories. Could return to his empty house and his empty life and pretend none of this had ever happened. But as he looked at this broken, bloodied woman who had somehow maintained her dignity through unspeakable horror, he knew there was no going back. Some lines, once crossed, changed a man forever. And he had crossed that line the moment he'd reached out his hand to help her stand. "Then we better make sure they don't find us," he said, spurring Jeremiah toward a narrow canyon that would take them home by a longer but safer route. As they disappeared into the maze of stone and shadow, the sound of pursuing horses grew fainter but never quite faded away. And somewhere in the darkness behind them, the real hunt was just beginning. Behind them, the ravens had already begun to gather. The oil lamp flickered against the cabin walls as Solomon cleaned the last of the dried blood from Nahumana's wounded arm, his weathered hand surprisingly gentle for a man who spent his days wrestling cattle and mending fence. The bullet had torn through the muscle but missed the bone, a blessing that could have easily been a curse in the hands of a less steady marksman. She sat rigid in the wooden chair beside his kitchen table, her dark eyes fixed on the shadows, dancing beyond the lamplight, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. "You've done this before," she observed, watching him work with the practiced efficiency of someone who had tended many wounds. Solomon's hands paused for just a moment. "War teaches a man many things he'd rather not know. Patching up bullet holes is one of them." He resumed his careful cleaning, noting how she never flinched despite what had to be considerable pain. "You could have bled out in that canyon. Why didn't you seek help sooner?" "Because help is a luxury the hunted cannot afford," Nahimana replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And because I learned long ago that showing weakness to strangers is the fastest way to become prey." The cabin fell silent except for the soft crackle of the fire and the distant howl of coyotes singing to the star-filled sky. Solomon's ranch house was modest but solid, built from local timber and chinked with prairie clay. It had been designed for a family with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen large enough for children to play while their mother cooked. Now it felt too large and too empty, a monument to dreams that had died with the people who were supposed to fill it. "Tell me about this." "Proof you carry," Solomon said as he began wrapping her arm with clean bandages. What could be worth murdering an entire band of peaceful travelers? Nahimana was quiet for so long that Solomon thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. 3 moons ago, my cousin, Running Bear, worked as a scout for the army. He was trusted, valuable to them because he knew the old trails and could speak with chiefs, who still remembered when the white man's word meant something. But Running Bear saw things he was not supposed to see. She paused, her eyes focusing on something beyond the cabin walls, beyond the present moment. Late one night, he followed Colonel Devereux to a secret meeting in the hills above Fort Randall. Hidden in the rocks, he watched as the colonel met with men who were not soldiers. Rich men from the east, men with soft hands and hard eyes who spoke of opportunities and profits to be made from Indian land. Solomon felt his gut tighten. What kind of opportunities? "Gold," Nahimana said simply. "Vast deposits discovered on the sacred lands where my people have agreed to live in peace. But the treaty forbids mining, forbids any white man from settling or digging there. So these men, these conspirators, they hatched a plan to make the treaty worthless." She reached beneath her torn dress and withdrew a leather satchel, its surface stained with blood, but still intact. With careful fingers she opened it and pulled out a stack of papers covered in precise handwriting and official seals. Running Bear heard every word, saw every document. When he tried to leave, they spotted him. He barely escaped with his life, but not before he gathered the evidence of their crimes. Solomon examined the papers by lamplight, his expression growing darker with each page. Maps showing mineral deposits on reservation land. Forged documents bearing fake signatures of Lakota chiefs agreeing to mining rights. Bills of sale for land that had never been legitimately purchased. And most damning of all, detailed plans for a series of staged attacks that would be blamed on hostile Indians, giving the army justification to break the peace treaty and drive the tribes from their gold-rich territories. "My God," Solomon breathed, "this isn't just theft. This is conspiracy to commit genocide." Running Bear brought these papers to our village, but he was dying from a bullet wound in his lung. Before he passed to the spirit world, he gave them to me and made me swear by the sacred pipe that I would find someone trustworthy enough to carry this truth to the authorities in Washington. Nahimana's voice cracked with emotion. "He died, believing that justice still existed in the white man's world." Solomon set the papers down carefully, understanding now why soldiers had murdered an entire band of innocents. These documents would destroy careers, topple fortunes, and send powerful men to prison or the gallows. They were worth more than gold, worth more than the lives of anyone who stood in the way of keeping them secret. "The attack on your people," he said slowly. "It wasn't random. No, someone betrayed us. Someone told Devereux that Running Bear had passed the evidence to me before he died. The colonel's men were waiting when we broke camp to travel to the winter grounds. They came at dawn with the sun at their backs, shooting without warning, without mercy." Nahimana's hands clenched into fists. "They killed children, Solomon. Babies who had never seen their first winter. All for pieces of paper that prove what we already knew, that some white men value gold more than human life. Solomon stood and walked to the window, staring out at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward the horizon. In the distance, he could see the graves where Rebecca and little Martha lay buried, stark reminders of how quickly a man's world could crumble. But this was different. This was about more than personal loss. This was about the kind of evil that festered in darkness and grew strong on the silence of good people who chose to look away. "Why trust me?" he asked without turning around. "You don't know me from Adam. For all you know, I could be part of this conspiracy." "Because you buried your wife and child with your own hands," Nehemiah replied quietly. "I saw the graves when we rode in. I saw how carefully you tend them, how you placed wildflowers on the small one, even though it's winter and flowers are hard to find. A man who grieves honestly for his own dead will not murder other men's children for gold." Solomon felt something twist in his chest, a mixture of pain and something else he hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe, or purpose. "What do you need from me?" "Safe passage to Fort Laramie. There's a territorial judge there, Judge Morrison, who has a reputation for honest dealing. If we can get these documents to him, if we can make him listen to our story." She trailed off, knowing how unlikely their chances really were. "Judge Morrison died last month," Solomon said gently. "Heart attack. They've got a new man now. Someone named Blackwood. Don't know much about him except that he came out from Chicago with strong recommendations." Nehemiah's face fell. "Then we are lost. By the time we could reach another honest authority, Devereaux will have found us. His reach is long, and his resources are vast." Solomon turned back to face her, his jaw set with determination. "Maybe not. I've got an old friend in Denver, a newspaper editor named Patrick O'Malley. He's got no love for corrupt politicians or crooked army officers. If we could get these documents to him, if he could publish the story. The newspapers have printed lies about my people for years," Nehemiah said bitterly. "Why would they suddenly care about truth?" "Because this isn't just about Indians," Solomon replied. "This affects everyone. If powerful men can stage fake attacks to steal treaty land, what's to stop them from staging attacks on white settlements that happen to sit on valuable minerals? Today, they're coming for your people. Tomorrow it could be any farmer or rancher who stands in their way." Nehemiah studied his face in the lamplight, searching for something she couldn't name. "You would risk your life for this? For people you've never met? For a cause that isn't your own?" Solomon thought of the empty chairs around his table, of the silence that had filled his life since loss had taken everything that mattered to him. But looking at this fierce, damaged woman who had somehow maintained her faith in justice despite witnessing unspeakable horrors, he felt something stir in the ashes of his heart. "Maybe it's time I started living for something besides grief," he said simply. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and moaning through the eaves like restless spirits. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then fell silent. It was the kind of silence that felt pregnant with possibility, the moment when fate balanced on the edge of a knife and waited for mortals to decide which way the blade would fall. "There's something else," Nehemiah said, her voice dropping to barely audible. "Something Running Bear discovered that isn't in those papers. Something he whispered to me with his dying breath." Solomon leaned forward. "What?" "Devereaux isn't the leader of this conspiracy. He's just the sword arm. The real power, the man pulling the strings from the shadows, is someone much closer to home. Someone who has been watching you, learning your habits, waiting for the right moment to use you as a pawn in his game." A chill ran down Solomon's spine. That had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the cabin walls. "Who?" Nehemiah met his eyes, and in them he saw a mixture of fear and resolve that made his blood run cold. "Your neighbor. The man who bought the ranch next to yours last spring." The man who always seems to know when you're away from home. Thomas. Hartwell isn't just a rancher, Solomon. He's Devereux's eyes and ears, and he's been preparing your grave since the day he arrived. The oil lamp flickered one final time and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. In the sudden blackness, Solomon felt the weight of terrible understanding settle over him like a shroud. He wasn't just harboring a fugitive. He was sleeping next to the enemy, and tomorrow that enemy would come calling with questions about missing cattle and concerned offers of help. Solomon's mind raced as he processed this revelation. Thomas Hartwell had arrived in the territory 6 months ago, purchasing the abandoned Mackenzie spread that bordered Solomon's land to the south. He'd presented himself as a widower looking for a fresh start, much like Solomon himself. They'd shared meals, traded labor during harvest season, and Hartwell had even helped Solomon repair his barn roof after a late spring storm. The man had seemed genuinely sympathetic to Solomon's loss, often mentioning his own dead wife, and how the frontier offered a chance for broken men to rebuild their lives. But now Solomon remembered things that had seemed innocent at the time. How Hartwell always seemed to know when Solomon planned to ride fence on the far pastures. How he'd volunteered to watch the ranch whenever Solomon traveled to town for supplies. How he'd asked seemingly casual questions about Solomon's past, his military service, his opinions on the Indian troubles plaguing the territory. "He's been building a profile," Solomon said aloud, his voice tight with anger. "Learning everything he could about my habits, my weaknesses, my isolation. Making sure I'd be the perfect patsy when the time came." Nayamana struck a match and relit the lamp, her face grave in the renewed light. Running Bear said Hartwell was more than just a spy. He said the man was Devereux's chief recruiter, responsible for identifying and eliminating potential threats to their operation. "Your name wasn't randomly chosen for that death list, Solomon. You were specifically targeted because Hartwell convinced them you were too dangerous to leave alive." "Dangerous how? I'm just a broken-down rancher with more ghosts than cattle." "Because you're honest," Nayamana said simply. "Because you fought in the war and understand military tactics. Because you know this country better than most and could survive long enough to cause problems if you stumbled onto their conspiracy. And because your isolation makes you expendable in the eyes of territorial authorities who wouldn't look too hard into your disappearance." Solomon felt a cold fury building in his chest, the kind of rage that had once made him a feared soldier in the war between the states. But this was different from battlefield anger. This was personal. These men had murdered his neighbor's family, corrupted his friendship with Hartwell, and planned to use his own grief as a weapon against innocent people. "There's more," Nahimana continued, pulling another document from the leather satchel. "Running Bear found evidence that your wife's death wasn't natural." The words hit Solomon like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" "Rebecca died of cholera. Half the territory was sick that summer. Look at this." Nayamana spread a piece of paper on the table, pointing to a list of names written in Hartwell's distinctive handwriting. "These are people who died in that outbreak. Notice anything unusual?" Solomon studied the list, his hands beginning to shake. Every name belonged to someone who had shown sympathy to local tribes. The missionary who had protested army raids on peaceful villages, the trader who had refused to sell whiskey to Indians, the doctor who had treated wounded Lakota without reporting their presence to military authorities. And there, near the bottom, Rebecca Wade, marked with a small notation that made Solomon's blood freeze. "Administered via contaminated well water," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "Jesus Christ, they poisoned the wells. Your wife died because she gave food to hungry Lakota children," Nahimana said gently. Hartwell reported her kindness to his superiors, and they decided she represented a security risk to their long-term plans. They couldn't risk her influence turning you against their eventual war. Solomon's vision blurred with tears of rage. The cholera outbreak that had claimed his wife and daughter hadn't been a natural disaster. It had been deliberate murder, designed to eliminate sympathetic whites and create a climate of fear that would make the territory more receptive to military solutions. Rebecca had died not from disease, but from her own compassion. How many others? He asked through gritted teeth. 17 families, 43 people total, including children. Nehemiah's voice was steady, but Solomon could see the pain in her eyes. They called it Operation Clean Slate. The idea was to remove any whites who might interfere with their plans while making it look like natural causes. Solomon stood abruptly, pacing to the window again. Outside, the night seemed darker than before, full of hidden enemies and deadly intentions. His peaceful ranch, his refuge from the world's cruelties, had been compromised from the moment Hartwell arrived. Every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of apparent friendship had been a lie designed to gather intelligence for his eventual murder. "We have to get out of here," he said, turning back to Nehemiah. "If Hartwell suspects I found you, if he thinks I know the truth—" "He already knows," Nehemiah interrupted. "Why do you think the soldiers drove your cattle through Devil's Canyon? Why do you think they left such an obvious trail for you to follow? They wanted you to find that massacre site. They wanted you to discover me." Solomon felt the room spin. Around him, "They wanted me to find you? Why?" "Because killing me in that canyon would have eliminated the evidence and given them a perfect excuse to hunt down any remaining survivors. You were supposed to stumble onto the scene, try to help, and die in the crossfire when Devereux's men arrived to rescue you from dangerous savages." Nehemiah's smile was bitter. "Instead, you succeeded in saving me and escaping their trap. Now they have to improvise, which means Hartwell will come calling tomorrow morning with some excuse to check on you. He'll search for signs of my presence, and when he finds them, he'll signal for the cavalry patrol that's undoubtedly camped just out of sight. They'll claim you were harboring a dangerous fugitive, that you died resisting arrest, and that I was killed trying to escape." Solomon sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy arrayed against them. "So we run, tonight. Put as much distance between us and this place as possible." "With what?" "Your horse is lame from yesterday's hard ride, and I can barely stay in the saddle with this wounded arm. We wouldn't make 10 miles before they ran us down." Nehemiah studied his face carefully. "There is another option. I'm listening. We turn the trap against them. Make them think their plan is working while we gather the evidence we need to expose them." Nehemiah leaned forward, her eyes bright with desperate cunning. "Hartwell trusts you. He believes you're the same broken, isolated man you've been for the past 3 years. What if we let him keep believing that?" Solomon frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "Tomorrow morning, when Hartwell comes to check on you, you tell him about finding the massacre site. You act shocked, horrified, exactly the way an innocent man would react. You mention seeing tracks that suggest one survivor might have escaped. But you lost the trail in the rocks." Nehemiah's voice grew more intense as she spoke. "You ask for his help organizing a search party. You play the concerned neighbor who wants to find the survivor before they die of exposure or fall into the hands of hostile Indians. And meanwhile I remain hidden, but not here, too dangerous. There's an old root cellar about a quarter-mile south of here, near the creek. It's overgrown, forgotten. I can hide there while you play your part, listening and watching for an opportunity to turn their own surveillance against them." Solomon considered the plan, recognizing both its potential and its dangers. It could work. But if they suspect anything, if Hartwell sees through the deception, then we die, Nehemiah said simply. But we die fighting instead of running. And maybe, just maybe, we take some of them with us. Outside, a horse whinnied softly in the distance, then fell silent. Both Solomon and Nehemiah froze, listening intently. The sound hadn't come from Solomon's corral. It had come from the direction of Hartwell's ranch, carrying on the still night air like a whispered warning. "He's moving already," Nahimana whispered, "getting into position for tomorrow's performance." Solomon felt the familiar weight of his service revolver on his hip, a comforting presence that reminded him of harder times when survival depended on quick thinking and quicker draws. The war had ended 15 years ago, but it seemed like conflict had found him again, whether he wanted it or not. "Get some rest," he told Nahimana. "Tomorrow we find out if we're as clever as we think we are, or if we're just two desperate people about to make a very big mistake." As Nahimana gathered her belongings and prepared to slip out into the darkness toward the hidden root cellar, Solomon checked his weapons one final time. The Winchester held 15 rounds, and he had 2 boxes of ammunition in the bedroom closet. His Colt carried 6 shots, with another cylinder's worth of bullets in his gun belt. Not much against a cavalry patrol, but enough to make them pay dearly for their victory. The last thing he saw, before she disappeared into the night, was Nahimana's hand touching the leather satchel beneath her dress, protecting the evidence that could topple a conspiracy and save countless lives. Tomorrow would bring either justice or death, and Solomon Wade found himself strangely at peace with either outcome. For the first time in 3 years, he had something worth fighting for again. The trap was closing, and they were already inside. The morning sun cast long shadows across Solomon's ranch when Thomas Hartwell rode up the dusty trail, his face a perfect mask of neighborly concern. Solomon watched from behind the kitchen curtains as Hartwell dismounted near the front porch, noting how the man's eyes swept the yard with the systematic precision of a scout reading enemy territory. Everything about Hartwell's posture screamed military training despite his civilian clothes, from the way he positioned his horse for a quick escape to how his right hand never strayed far from the pistol beneath his coat. Solomon forced himself to breathe normally as he opened the front door, arranging his features into the expression of a man grateful for company after a sleepless night. "Thomas," he called out, injecting just the right amount of exhaustion into his voice. "Thank God you're here. I've got something to show you that'll turn your stomach." Hartwell's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest, though his voice remained carefully neutral. "Morning, Solomon. You look like hell." "Rough night?" "Rougher than you know." Solomon stepped onto the porch, noting how Hartwell's gaze immediately began cataloging details. Looking for signs of Nahimana's presence, no doubt. "Found my cattle yesterday. What was left of them anyway. But that's not the worst of it." "Rustlers?" Hartwell moved closer, and Solomon caught the faint scent of gun oil and leather. The man was armed for war, not neighborly visits. "Worse. Much worse." Solomon's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "Found a massacre site in Devil's Canyon. Indians looked like a whole family group, men, women, children, all shot to pieces. Cavalry work from the look of the arrows and the way the bodies were arranged." Hartwell's expression didn't change, but Solomon caught the brief flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "That's terrible news." "Any survivors? That's what's got me spooked." Solomon rubbed his face with shaking hands, playing the part of a man, barely holding himself together. "Found tracks leading away from the killing ground. Small feet, light step. Could be a woman, maybe even a child who got away. Trail disappeared in the rocks, but if someone's out there hurt and scared, you did the right thing coming back," Hartwell said, his voice taking on the tone of a man calming a frightened animal. "This is Army business now. Best thing we can do is report it to Fort Randall and let the professionals handle it." Solomon felt his jaw clench at the smooth lie, but forced himself to nod eagerly. "That's exactly what I was thinking." "But Thomas, what if that survivor is still out there? What if they're dying while we ride to the fort and back? I keep thinking about my Rebecca, how she'd have wanted me to help if it was her lost and bleeding in the wilderness." The mention of Rebecca caused something cold to flicker behind Hartwell's eyes, and Solomon realized with sick certainty that this man had known exactly what kind of poison had been used to murder his wife. Had probably helped plan her death, down to the last detail. "I understand your feelings," Hartwell said carefully. "But tracking dangerous fugitives is work for trained soldiers, not ranchers. These could be the same hostiles who killed those innocent families. They might set an ambush for anyone who tries to help." Solomon let desperation creep into his voice. "But you've got experience with this kind of thing, haven't you? You mentioned serving in the territorial militia before you came here. And you know this country almost as well as I do now." Hartwell seemed to consider this, though Solomon suspected the man was really calculating how best to spring his trap. "I suppose we could take a quick look around. Make sure there's no immediate danger before we involve the army." He paused, studying Solomon's face. "You said the trail disappeared in the rocks, near the eastern wall of the canyon. Lot of places someone could hide up there, caves and such. But also a lot of places someone could die if they're hurt bad." Solomon let his voice crack slightly. "I can't shake the feeling that we're the only chance that Survivor has." "All right," Hartwell decided. "Let me get some supplies from my place, and we'll ride out together. 2 hours should be enough to determine if there's anyone still alive up there." As Hartwell mounted his horse and rode toward his own ranch, Solomon felt a mixture of relief and terror. The first phase of their desperate plan was working. Hartwell believed he was dealing with the same grief-stricken, guilt-ridden neighbor he'd been manipulating for months. But now came the truly dangerous part. Solomon quickly saddled his horse and checked his weapons, making sure everything appeared normal while actually preparing for battle. The Winchester went into its saddle scabbard as always, but he made sure it was fully loaded with a round in the chamber. His Colt revolver hung openly on his hip, the leather holster positioned for a fast draw. To casual observation, he looked like any rancher heading out to search rough country. In reality, he was a veteran soldier preparing for what might be his final fight. 20 minutes later, Hartwell returned with a larger party than Solomon had expected. 3 men rode with him, all bearing the unmistakable bearing of cavalry troopers. In civilian clothes. Solomon recognized the type immediately, hard-faced professionals who had probably seen action in a dozen Indian campaigns. They wore their weapons like extensions of their bodies, and their eyes held the flat, emotionless stare of men who killed for a living. "Brought some help," Hartwell announced with false cheer. "These boys were passing through on their way to Fort Randall. Figured they might be useful if we run into trouble." Solomon nodded as if this made perfect sense, though internally he was calculating odds and angles. 4 armed men against 1, in open country where cavalry training would give them every advantage. The smart play would be to make an excuse and retreat to his ranch, but that would only delay the inevitable confrontation. "Appreciate the backup," Solomon said, swinging into his saddle. "Let's get moving before the trail gets any colder." They rode south toward Devil's Canyon in formation, with Solomon leading and the others spread out behind him in a loose, diamond pattern that would make escape impossible if shooting started. Hartwell kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking seemingly innocent questions about the massacre site, the condition of the bodies, the exact location where Solomon had lost the survivors' trail. Each question felt like a probe, testing the consistency of Solomon's story and searching for gaps that might reveal the truth. "Terrible thing, massacring families like that," Hartwell said as they approached the canyon's rim. "Makes a man wonder, what kind of savages could do such a thing to women and children? Army's been saying for years that the only good Indian is a dead Indian," one of the false civilians added with a cruel grin. Maybe someone finally decided to do something about it. Solomon felt rage burn in his chest but kept his voice level. Murder's murder, regardless of who does it. Killing children isn't something civilized men should celebrate. Hartwell shot his companion a warning look. "Of course not. We're all hoping this was the work of renegades, not regular army units. That kind of unauthorized action could cause serious diplomatic problems. They descended into the canyon using the same trail Solomon had followed the day before, past the killing ground where the horses still lay scattered like broken toys. The false civilians examined the scene with professional interest, noting details that civilian ranchers would never have spotted. These men had seen similar massacres before, had probably participated in them. Sloppy work, one muttered to Hartwell. Someone was in a hurry. Clean it up later, Hartwell replied quietly. Right now we need to focus on finding that survivor. Solomon led them to the spot where he'd supposedly lost Nahimana's trail. Near a jumble of boulders that offered a dozen different escape routes, the area had been carefully chosen. Close enough to the hidden root cellar that Nahimana could observe their movements, but far enough away that a search wouldn't accidentally reveal her hiding place. Trail ends here, Solomon announced, dismounting to examine the rocky ground. Could have gone in any direction from this point. Lot of places to hide up in those rocks. Hartwell studied the terrain with the eye of a man planning an ambush. We'll need to split up to cover all the possible routes. Johnson, you take the north face. Miller, check the creek bed. Davis, sweep the eastern approaches. Solomon and I will work our way up the main trail. The casual use of military-style surnames confirmed what Solomon already suspected. These weren't civilians at all, but active-duty soldiers operating under Hartwell's command. They spread out with practiced efficiency, each man taking a position that would allow them to converge quickly if their quarry was flushed from hiding. As Solomon and Hartwell climbed toward the higher caves, Solomon found himself studying his supposed neighbor with new eyes. Everything about Thomas Hartwell was a carefully constructed lie. His story about being a widowed rancher seeking the new start. His apparent sympathy for Solomon's loss. His neighborly offers of help and friendship. All of it had been theater, designed to position him as the perfect spy and eventual executioner. You know, Hartwell said conversationally as they picked their way between the boulders, I've been thinking about what you told me, about finding that survivor's trail. Thing is, Solomon, I've been tracking Indians for more years than I care to count, and I'm having trouble seeing the signs you described. Solomon felt his blood turn to ice water, but kept his voice steady. Different people see different things, I suppose. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe you were. Hartwell stopped walking and turned to face Solomon directly. Or maybe you found something you weren't supposed to find. Maybe that survivor didn't escape. After all, maybe she's been hiding in your cabin for the past day and night, filling your head with lies about army conspiracies and murdered Indians. The pretense was over. Solomon's hand drifted toward his gun, but Hartwell was already drawing his own weapon with the fluid motion of a man who had done this many times before. Easy now, Hartwell said, his voice taking on the cold authority of command. No need for anyone else to die today. Just tell me where the woman is hiding, and we can end this quickly. Don't know what you're talking about, Solomon replied, though they both knew the lie was pointless now. Of course you do. Nahimana, daughter of Chief Black Bear, keeper of stolen documents that could embarrass certain important people. She's been seen with you, Solomon. My men spotted you riding double yesterday evening, heading back toward your ranch. Did you really think we weren't watching? Solomon's mind raced. If they'd been observed returning from the canyon, then the entire plan was compromised. Nahimana was walking into a trap, and there was nothing he could do to warn her without revealing her location. Here's what's going to happen, Hartwell continued, his pistol steady as granite. You're going to call out to your little Indian friend. Tell her to come out with her hands visible, carrying whatever papers she stole from Colonel Devereux. She surrenders peacefully, and you both die quick and clean. She tries to run, and we spend the rest of the day making you both wish you'd never been born. Solomon looked into Hartwell's eyes and saw the truth there. These men had no intention of letting either of them live, regardless of cooperation. The only question was whether their deaths would serve any purpose beyond eliminating witnesses. And if I refuse? Hartwell's smile was as cold as winter wind. Then we start with your fingers and work our way up. Amazing how much pain a man can endure when properly motivated. And Solomon? I know exactly how much you can take. I've been studying you for 6 months, learning all your strengths and weaknesses. Your guilt over failing to save your wife. Your desperate need to find meaning in your empty life. Your pathetic hope that helping one Indian woman might somehow redeem your coward soul. The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to break Solomon's spirit before the real torture began. But instead of despair, Solomon felt something else rising in his chest. A cold, deadly calm that he remembered from the war, when death was certain and the only choice left was how to face it. You're right about one thing, Solomon said quietly. I have been looking for redemption. But I think I finally found it. His hand moved toward his gun, knowing he was too slow, knowing Hartwell would kill him before the Colt cleared leather. But sometimes a man had to make his stand regardless of the odds, especially when innocent blood was at stake. The shot that rang out across Devil's Canyon came from neither Solomon's gun nor Hartwell's. It came from the rocks above them, where Nahimana crouched with a captured cavalry rifle, her wounded arm steadied against a boulder as she sighted down the barrel at the men who had murdered her family. Thomas. Hartwell toppled backward with a hole through his chest, his eyes wide with the surprise of a predator who had suddenly become prey. In the shocked silence that followed, Solomon heard the distinctive war cry of a Lakota warrior echoing off the canyon walls, and he knew that the real battle was just beginning. The echo of Nahimana's rifle shot was still reverberating off the canyon walls when chaos erupted across Devil's Canyon like a prairie fire in a dry wind. The 3 disguised soldiers immediately took cover behind the scattered boulders, their weapons appearing in their hands with the practiced speed of men who had survived countless firefights. But in that crucial first moment of confusion, while they sought shelter and tried to locate their unseen attacker, Solomon dove behind the nearest rock outcropping and finally cleared leather with his Colt revolver. The man called Johnson, crouched behind a fallen log 30 yards away, made the mistake of exposing his shoulder while trying to get a sight line on Nahimana's position. Solomon's first shot took him high in the chest, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the rocky ground. The sound of the impact, a wet slap followed by a grunt of pain, told Solomon the wound was serious but not immediately fatal. Miller, Davis, flank left and right. Johnson shouted through gritted teeth, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder. The squaw's in the rocks above the main trail. Pin her down while I work around behind. But Nahimana had already moved. The muzzle flash from her rifle bloomed from a completely different position, 50 yards north of where she'd fired the killing shot that dropped Hartwell. Her second bullet sparked off the boulder where Miller was taking cover, showering him with sharp fragments of stone that drew blood and curses in equal measure. Solomon used the distraction to advance, moving in a low crouch from rock to rock, using every bit of cover the broken terrain provided. His years of fighting Apache and Comanche raiders had taught him that in this kind of broken country, the man who moved fastest and shot straightest usually went home to his family. The key was to never stay in one place long enough for the enemy to fix your position and coordinate their fire. Davis, a lean man with the pale eyes of a killer, spotted Solomon's movement and swung his rifle around for a shot. But Solomon was already rolling behind another boulder when the bullet whined through the space where his head had been a heartbeat before. He came up firing, his Colt bucking in his hand as he put 2 quick shots into the space where Davis was. Crouched. The first bullet missed clean, but the second caught Davis in the thigh, dropping him to one knee with a scream that echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of a wounded animal. Blood immediately began soaking through his pants, dark and arterial, the kind of bleeding that could kill a man in minutes if it wasn't stopped. "I'm hit bad," Davis yelled to his remaining companions, legs pumping blood like a stuck pig. Miller, realizing that their tactical advantage was rapidly disappearing, made a desperate play for higher ground. He broke from cover and scrambled up a narrow ledge that would give him a commanding view of both Solomon's position and the area where Nehemana was conducting her deadly game of hide and seek. But climbing made him vulnerable, and both Solomon and Nehemana recognized the opportunity. Their shots came simultaneously, a perfectly coordinated volley from two different angles that caught Miller in a crossfire he couldn't escape. Solomon's bullet shattered his left elbow, while Nehemana's rifle round punched through his ribcage just below the armpit. Miller toppled from the ledge like a sack of grain, landing hard on the rocky ground with a wet thud that suggested several bones had broken in the fall. The sudden silence that followed was more ominous than the gunfire had been. Johnson, despite his shoulder wound, was still mobile and dangerous. Davis was bleeding heavily, but still armed. And somewhere in the maze of rocks and shadows, more enemies might be waiting. The smart thing would be to retreat, to put distance between themselves and whatever reinforcements Hartwell might have arranged. But Solomon found himself thinking about Rebecca, about the children who had died in that plague that wasn't a plague, about all the innocent people who would suffer if Devereux's conspiracy succeeded. Running might save their lives, but it would doom countless others to the same fate that had befallen Nehemana's family. "Nehemana," he called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We need to move. More soldiers could be coming." Her reply came from yet another position, somewhere among the higher rocks where the afternoon shadows were deepest. "The wounded. One is trying to circle behind you. 50 yards to your right, moving through the dry creek bed." Solomon immediately shifted position, working his way toward the creek bed she had indicated. Sure enough, Johnson was there, crawling through the sandy bottom on his belly, leaving a trail of blood that still clutching his rifle with grim determination. The man's face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes still burned with the fanatic devotion of a soldier following orders. "End of the line, Johnson," Solomon called out, his Colt trained on the wounded man's center mass. "Drop the rifle, and we'll get you patched up. Keep fighting, and you'll bleed out in this creek bed." Johnson's response was to try to bring his rifle around for a shot, but the movement opened his shoulder wound wider, sending a fresh gush of blood down his arm. His hands shook with weakness and pain, making accurate shooting impossible. Solomon's shot took him center chest, ending the threat permanently. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though Solomon knew it had only been minutes since the shooting started. His ears rang from the gunfire, and the acrid smell of burnt powder hung in the still air like incense at a funeral. 3 men were dead, a 4th was dying, and somewhere in the rocks above, Nehemana was probably reloading her captured rifle and scanning for new threats. "Solomon." Her voice drifted down from the heights, urgent but controlled. "There are more riders coming from the east. At least 6, moving fast." Solomon felt his stomach drop. 6 more soldiers meant they were facing a full squad, probably with better weapons and more experience than the men they'd just defeated. In open country, cavalry could run down fleeing fugitives with ease. But here in the broken terrain of Devil's Canyon, infantry tactics might give them a fighting chance. "Can you see them clearly?" he called back. "Blue uniforms, led by an officer with gold braid. They'll be here in 10 minutes. 10 minutes to prepare for a battle they couldn't possibly win through conventional means." But Solomon had learned in the war that conventional thinking got good men killed, while desperate creativity sometimes opened paths to victory that textbook tactics never considered. "Nehemana, can you get down here without being seen?" "Yes." But why? Because we're going to give Colonel Devereux something he's not expecting. We're going to hand him a victory that destroys him. 5 minutes later, Nehemana had worked her way down from the rocks and joined Solomon in a defensive position among the larger boulders near the canyon center. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had been born to this country, every step placed with the precision of a hunter who understood that survival often depended on leaving no trace of her passage. "What's your plan?" she asked, checking the loads in the rifle she'd taken from one of the dead soldiers. Solomon was busy arranging the bodies of their enemies, positioning them to tell a specific story when the cavalry arrived. "We're going to stage our own massacre," he explained grimly. "Make it look like we died fighting each other, leaving Devereux's men to find nothing but corpses and burned evidence. You want to fake our deaths? More than that. I want to make Devereux think he's won completely, that his conspiracy is safe and his enemies are eliminated. Men who think they're untouchable make mistakes, and mistakes create opportunities." Nehemana studied his face in the fading light, searching for signs of madness or desperation. Instead, she saw the calm calculation of a man who had faced impossible odds before and found ways to turn defeat into victory. "This is a dangerous gamble," she said quietly. "If we're discovered, If we're discovered, we die fighting instead of running," Solomon replied. "But if it works, if we can convince them that the threat is over, then we'll have the time and freedom we need to get that evidence to someone who can act on it." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of cavalry equipment and the shouted orders of men deploying for battle. Devereux's reinforcements were almost upon them, and there was no more time for debate or second-guessing. Solomon quickly splashed lamp oil from his saddlebags across the scattered papers they'd taken from some of the dead soldiers, creating the impression that important documents had been destroyed in the fighting. He positioned Hartwell's body to suggest that the man had died, trying to protect sensitive materials from falling into enemy hands. "The cave system behind the waterfall," Nehemana whispered urgently. "There's a passage that leads to an exit 3 miles downstream. We can hide there until the soldiers finish their investigation and leave. How long can we hold out? Days if necessary. There's fresh water and shelter from the weather, and She hesitated. "There's something else hidden there. Something Running Bear told me about before he died. A cache of weapons and supplies that the army doesn't know exists." Solomon felt a flicker of hope. Hidden weapons meant they weren't completely helpless. Fresh water and shelter meant they could wait out the immediate pursuit. And if Devereux's men believed they were dead, it would buy precious time to plan their next move. The sound of boots on stone announced the arrival of the cavalry patrol. Solomon and Nehemana pressed themselves deeper into the narrow crevice they'd chosen as their hiding place, barely breathing as the soldiers spread out across the killing ground. "Colonel Devereux," a sergeant's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "We've got multiple bodies down here. Looks like Hartwell's team ran into serious resistance." Heavy footsteps approached their hiding place, accompanied by the metallic sounds of men checking weapons and preparing for battle. Through a crack in the rocks, Solomon could see polished cavalry boots and the gold trim of an officer's uniform. Colonel Marcus Devereux himself had come to oversee the final act of his conspiracy. "Report, Sergeant." Devereux's voice was cultured, educated, the kind of tone that spoke of West Point training and Eastern money. "What's the tactical situation?" "4 friendly KIA, sir. Hartwell, Johnson, Miller, and Davis, all good men. Looks like they cornered the fugitives here and engaged in close combat. Found evidence of document destruction, papers burned beyond recognition." "And the targets?" "Blood trails leading toward the waterfall, sir. Heavy bleeding, probably fatal. Wounds, my guess is they crawled off to die somewhere in the cave system. Want me to send a detail in after them?" Solomon held his breath, knowing that everything depended on Devereux's next decision. If the colonel ordered a thorough search of the caves, their deception would be discovered within hours. "Negative, Sergeant," Devereux said after a moment's consideration. "Those caves go on for miles, and wounded animals tend to find the deepest, darkest holes to die in. We don't have the time or manpower for an extended search, and frankly, we don't need it. Dead is dead, whether we find the bodies or not." "What about the evidence, sir? The stolen documents?" "Destroyed by the look of it. Hartwell died protecting our interests, just as I knew he would. The conspiracy dies with him and the Indian woman." Devereux's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Clean up this mess, Sergeant. I want the bodies buried, and all traces of this operation eliminated. As far as the official record is concerned, Thomas Hartwell died defending his ranch from hostile raiders. As the soldiers began the grim work of disposing of evidence, Solomon felt Nahimana's hand find his in the darkness. Her fingers were cold but steady, and he drew strength from her presence. They had won the first round of their war against Devereux's conspiracy, but the real battle was just beginning. In the hidden depths of Devil's Canyon, two ghosts began planning their resurrection. 3 weeks after their supposed deaths in Devil's Canyon, Solomon Wade and Nahimana emerged from the hidden cave system like avenging spirits stepping out of the underworld. The autumn air carried the bite of coming winter, and the aspens on the mountainsides had turned to molten gold, but neither of them noticed the beauty around them. Their eyes were fixed on the sprawling military compound of Fort Randall, spread across the valley below like a cancer on the pristine landscape. During their time in hiding, they had become something more dangerous than fugitives. They had become ghosts with a purpose, invisible enemies who could strike without warning and disappear without a trace. The weapons cache Running Bear had hidden in the deepest part of the cave system had provided them with everything they needed for their new war against Devereux's conspiracy. Rifles, ammunition, dynamite, and most importantly, detailed maps of every military installation, mining operation, and government building within 300 miles. "The supply train leaves Fort Randall every Tuesday at dawn," Nahimana said, studying the compound through a pair of captured field glasses. 40 wagons carrying equipment and supplies to the mining camps in the Black Hills. It follows the same route every week, through Miller's Pass where the road narrows between two cliff faces. Solomon nodded grimly, checking the loads in the stolen army rifle he now carried. "How many guards?" 20 soldiers, plus the wagon drivers. "But they're not expecting trouble. Why would they be? As far as they know, all the hostile Indians in the territory are either dead or safely contained on reservations." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Devereux's conspiracy to eliminate sympathetic whites and justify a war of extermination had created the very enemy he feared most. By trying to destroy the evidence of his crimes, he had forged two broken souls into weapons that would be turned against him. "The explosives are in place," Solomon reported, lowering his own field glasses. "Took me 3 nights to plant them. All, but the charges are positioned to bring down enough rock to block the pass completely. When that supply train hits the bottleneck, they'll be trapped like fish in a barrel." "And the diversion?" "Set for noon, just like we planned. The fire at the lumber mill will draw most of the garrison away from the fort, leaving minimal security for the administrative buildings. That's when you make your move on Devereux's office." Nahima's face hardened with determination. Over the past 3 weeks, she had transformed from a wounded refugee into something far more dangerous. Her injured arm had healed stronger than before, and her movements had acquired the deadly precision of a predator who had learned to hunt in the shadows. She wore captured army gear now, dark clothing that would make her invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, and she carried enough weapons to outfit a small war party. "The colonel keeps his personal files in a safe behind his desk," she said. "Running Bear saw him use it during their secret meetings. If we can get inside and photograph those documents with the camera equipment we took from the cave, Then we'll have proof that goes beyond anything they can deny or explain away, Solomon finished. Names, dates, bank account numbers, the whole conspiracy laid out in Devereaux's own handwriting. The plan they had developed was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its potential consequences. While Solomon created chaos with the supply train ambush, drawing attention and resources away from Fort Randall, Nehemiah would infiltrate the compound and break into Devereaux's private office. But success would mean painting targets on their backs that would never go away. Failure would mean deaths that would make their staged massacre in Devil's Canyon look like a mercy killing. "There's something else," Nehemiah said quietly, her voice carrying a note Solomon had never heard before. "Something I haven't told you about what Running Bear discovered before he died." Solomon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain. "Air. What kind of something?" "The conspiracy goes deeper than we thought. Devereaux isn't just working with Eastern businessmen and corrupt officials. He's been in contact with foreign agents, men who want to see America weakened by internal conflict. The Indian Wars aren't just about gold and land. They're about creating so much chaos and bloodshed that the federal government becomes paralyzed." The implications hit Solomon like a physical blow. "You're talking about treason. Not just murder and theft, but actual betrayal of the country." Running Bear found correspondence between Devereaux and representatives of the British government. They're providing funding and weapons for the conspiracy in exchange for access to American mineral resources and strategic intelligence about our military capabilities. Solomon stared down at Fort Randall with new eyes, seeing not just a military installation, but a nest of traitors who were selling out their own nation for personal profit. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, reaching from frontier trading posts to the highest levels of government and beyond to foreign powers who viewed American expansion as a threat to their own interests. How many people are involved? Dozens, maybe hundreds. Politicians, army officers, businessmen, even some tribal leaders who have been bribed or threatened into cooperation. It's a web that spans the entire Western Territory, and everyone caught. And it has blood on their hands. The weight of this knowledge settled on Solomon's shoulders like a lead blanket. They weren't just fighting to expose a criminal conspiracy. They were standing against a network of traitors whose reach extended far beyond anything two people could hope to defeat. But they were also the only ones who knew the truth, the only ones who could act before the conspiracy achieved its ultimate goals. "All the more reason to strike now," Solomon said finally, "before they realize we're still alive and dangerous." As dawn approached, they made their final preparations with the methodical care of soldiers who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Solomon checked his explosives one last time, ensuring that each charge was properly connected to the central detonation system. Nehemiah reviewed her infiltration route through the fort's defenses, memorizing every guard post and patrol schedule. "Remember," Solomon said as they prepared to separate for their individual missions, "if something goes wrong, if you're discovered or captured, the priority is getting that evidence to the outside world. Don't try to rescue me. Don't risk the larger mission for personal loyalty." Nehemiah looked at him with eyes that held depths of feeling she had never allowed herself to express. "You saved my life in that canyon. You chose to stand with me when you could have walked away. I won't abandon you now. And I won't let your people's sacrifice be meaningless," Solomon replied. "We both have debts to pay and promises to keep. But if we're going to honor the dead, we need to stay alive long enough to see justice done." The supply train rolled out of Fort Randall exactly on schedule. 40 heavy wagons loaded with equipment destined for the illegal mining operations in the Black Hills. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like ghostly fingers, providing perfect cover for Solomon's approach to Miller's Pass. He waited in the rocks above the narrow defile, his hand on the detonator that would turn the peaceful mountain pass into a killing ground dot below him. The wagons moved in a long, vulnerable column, their wheels creaking and their traces jingling in the crisp morning air. The escort rode alongside with the casual alertness of men who had made this journey many times without incident. They had no reason to suspect that death was waiting in the rocks above, that their routine supply run was about to become a trap that would expose the corruption rotting at the heart of the territorial government. At exactly 8:30, when the lead wagon reached the narrowest part of the pass, Solomon pressed the detonator. The explosions came in sequence, a thunderous roar that brought thousands of tons of rock cascading down from the cliff faces. The narrow road disappeared under an avalanche of stone, trapping the supply train in a canyon that had become a prison. But Solomon's real target wasn't the wagons or their guards. His target was the documentation that would be found in the wreckage, carefully planted evidence that would tell a very specific story to anyone who investigated the attack. Forged orders bearing Devereaux's signature, directing the transport of illegal weapons to unauthorized recipients. Bank drafts showing payments to fictional Indian war parties. Maps marking the locations of planned attacks on civilian settlements. By the time the dust settled and the survivors began digging out their dead, Solomon was already miles away, riding hard toward Fort Randall, where Nehemana would be making her own assault on the heart of the conspiracy. Behind him, he left a mystery that would launch investigations reaching all the way to Washington. Questions that would demand answers Devereaux couldn't provide without exposing his own crimes. At Fort Randall, the lumber mill fire started exactly at noon, sending a column of black smoke into the clear autumn sky. Within minutes, soldiers were running toward the blaze with buckets and shovels, leaving only a skeleton crew to guard the administrative buildings. Nehemana watched from her hiding place in the post-settlers' storage shed as most of the garrison rushed to fight the spreading flames. The fire had been carefully planned to create maximum chaos without causing civilian casualties. The mill was located downwind from the main residential areas, and Solomon had ensured that the blaze would burn hot and fast, consuming the building completely, but not spreading to other structures. It was designed to be spectacular enough to draw attention but contained enough to avoid creating genuine tragedy. Moving with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, Nehemana slipped from shadow to shadow across the parade ground, avoiding the few sentries who remained at their posts. Her dark clothing made her virtually invisible in the smoke-hazed air, and her knowledge of the fort's layout allowed her to avoid the main thoroughfares where she might be spotted by casual observers. Devereaux's office was located on the second floor of the administrative building, behind a door marked with his name and rank in gold lettering. The lock was more substantial than Nehemana had expected, but the tools Running Bear had cached in the cave system included everything needed for such work. Within minutes, she was inside the colonel's private domain, surrounded by the maps and documents that chronicled a career built on corruption and betrayal. The safe was exactly where Running Bear had said it would be, hidden behind a portrait of President Hayes that swung aside on concealed hinges. The combination lock presented a more serious challenge, but Nehemana had come prepared for that as well. The nitroglycerin charges were tiny, just enough to crack the lock mechanism without destroying the contents inside. What she found in the safe exceeded even her worst expectations. Hundreds of documents detailing every aspect of the conspiracy, from the planned assassination of sympathetic government officials to the coordination of attacks designed to justify military action against peaceful tribes. Bank records showing payments from foreign sources, correspondence with British agents operating under diplomatic cover, and most damning of all, a ledger listing every person who had been murdered to protect the conspiracy's secrets. Rebecca Wade's name was there, along with 42 others who had died in the staged cholera outbreak. The details were meticulous, clinical in their precision. Poison types, delivery methods, timing coordinated to avoid suspicion. It was a manual for genocide, written in Devereaux's own careful script. But as Nehemana began photographing the documents with the camera equipment they had salvaged, She heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps in the hallway outside, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged in this building. Too many footsteps for a single guard making his rounds. The fire was a diversion, a voice said through the door. A voice she recognized with sick certainty. Colonel Devereux himself, accompanied by what sounded like at least 4 other men. Someone wanted the garrison distracted while they broke into my office. The question is who, and how much they know. Nehemiah realized with growing horror that their plan had been anticipated, that somehow Devereux had seen through their deception. She was trapped in his office with evidence that could destroy the conspiracy, but she had no way to escape without walking directly into the arms of her enemies. Search every room, Devereux ordered. And remember, our visitors might be more dangerous than they appear. According to certain recent reports, some people who are supposed to be dead have been remarkably active in the past few weeks. As the door handle began to turn, Nehemiah made a desperate decision that would determine whether justice would prevail or die with her in a hail of bullets. She couldn't escape, but she could ensure that the truth survived even if she didn't. With steady hands, she continued photographing documents even as the footsteps approached, racing against time to capture the evidence that would bring down a conspiracy that reached from the frontier to the halls of power in distant capitals. Door opened just as she finished the last photograph, and Colonel Marcus Devereux stepped into his office to find himself face to face with a ghost who carried the power to destroy everything he had built. Colonel Marcus Devereux stood in the doorway of his office like a man who had just seen his own death foretold, his pale eyes fixed on the Lakota woman who shouldn't exist, but was somehow standing beside his violated, safe with a camera in her hands and defiance blazing in her dark eyes. For a moment that stretched like eternity, neither of them moved. Hunter and hunted frozen in a tableau that would determine the fate of a conspiracy, reaching from the frontier territories to the corridors of power in Washington and beyond. Nehemiah of the Bear Clan, Devereux said finally, his cultured voice carrying the tone of a man greeting an old acquaintance rather than a mortal enemy. Running Bear's cousin, the mystic who sees secrets in shadows and carries the voices of the dead. I must admit, your resurrection is more impressive than anything in the Christian Gospels. Behind him, 4 armed men filed into the office with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had performed similar tasks many times before. But these weren't ordinary cavalry troopers. These were Devereux's personal enforcers, men whose loyalty had been purchased with gold and sealed with shared guilt. Their faces held the cold professionalism of executioners who took pride in their work. You killed my family, Nehemiah said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of sacred judgment. You murdered my people for gold and lies. You poisoned wells and blamed disease. You turned neighbor against neighbor and made widows of women whose only crime was showing kindness to hungry children. Devereux stepped into the office, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like the closing of a coffin lid. I served the interests of progress and civilization. Your people were obstacles to the natural evolution of this continent. What I did was necessary, inevitable, and ultimately beneficial to the greater good of humanity. And the British gold? The foreign agents? Was betraying your own country also necessary for the greater good? For the first time, Devereux's composed facade cracked slightly. You've been busy during your time among the dead. Those documents represent legitimate business, relationships with international investors who share our vision of rational resource development. They represent treason, Nehemiah replied, holding up the camera that contained evidence of crimes spanning decades. And this contains proof that will destroy you and everyone connected to your conspiracy. Devereux's eyes fixed on the camera with the intensity of a serpent watching prey. Give me the device, and I'll grant you a quick death. Refuse, and my men will demonstrate techniques they learned from Comanche torture masters. I promise you. The choice between cooperation and agony is not one you want to make lightly. But even as the colonel spoke, Nahimana was calculating distances and angles, her warrior's mind mapping the room for weapons and escape routes. The office windows opened onto a 2-story drop to the parade ground below. Survivable for someone desperate enough to risk broken bones, but only if she could reach the windows before Devereaux's men could stop her. "Where is your friend?" Devereaux asked conversationally. "The grieving widower who thought he could play soldier?" Solomon Wade, the man who buried his wife and child without ever suspecting that their deaths were carefully orchestrated murders, designed to isolate him for eventual elimination. Nahimana felt her blood turn to ice. If Devereaux knew about Solomon's role in their plans, if he had anticipated their coordinated attack. "Oh yes, we know about Mr. Wade's touching transformation. From broken rancher to avenging angel. We've been watching him since the moment he carried you away from Devil's Canyon. Did you really think we wouldn't notice when dead people started interfering with supply trains and setting fires to create diversions?" The realization hit Nahimana like a physical blow. They had been operating under surveillance for weeks there. Every move monitored and analyzed by enemies who stayed always one step ahead. The supply train ambush, the lumber mill fire, even their infiltration of the fort had been anticipated and allowed to proceed for reasons she couldn't yet fathom. "You wanted us to come here," she said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "You let us think we were succeeding because you needed us to expose ourselves." Devereaux smiled with genuine pleasure, the expression of a chess master, revealing a strategy that had been planned dozens of moves in advance. "Precisely. You see, dead heroes become martyrs, but living criminals can be interrogated, forced to reveal their accomplices and methods. When we're finished with you, we'll know the location of every weapons cache, every safe house, every person who aided your resurrection. And then we'll eliminate them all, along with anyone else who might pose a future threat to our operations. Your little adventure will provide us with the perfect excuse to implement the final phase of our plan. Complete pacification of the territory through the systematic elimination of all potentially hostile elements." Outside the office windows, Nahimana could see smoke rising from multiple locations around the fort. Not just the lumber mill, but other buildings as well. Too many fires to be accidental, too coordinated to be random. Solomon wasn't just creating a diversion. He was burning down the entire installation. "Your friend is more resourceful than we anticipated," Devereaux admitted, following her gaze. "But resourcefulness without wisdom is simply elaborate suicide. Every fire he sets provides us with more evidence of his terrorist activities. Every explosion gives us justification for the harsh measures we'll implement in response." The sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere near the main gate, sustained volleys that spoke of serious combat rather than simple security responses. Shouts echoed across the parade ground as soldiers rushed to defend positions that were apparently under coordinated attack. But how was that possible? Solomon was one man against an entire garrison. Unless the supply train, Nahimana breathed. "You didn't just let him attack it, you were waiting for him." Mr. Wade's ambush succeeded brilliantly, Devereaux confirmed. 20 soldiers killed, 40 wagons destroyed, valuable supplies lost to sabotage. But what he didn't realize was that the entire convoy was a carefully prepared trap. Hidden among those wagons were 50 additional troops, along with enough evidence to frame your entire resistance network for crimes that will justify any response we choose to implement. The gunfire was getting closer now, moving steadily toward the administrative building where they faced each other across the ruins of Devereaux's careful plans. But instead of panic, Nahimana felt a strange calm settling over her spirit. The voices of her ancestors seemed to whisper in her ears, reminding her that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. "You made one mistake," she said quietly, "and what was that? You assumed we were acting alone." The explosion that rocked the building came from directly below them. A carefully placed charge that brought down the entire first floor in a cascade of splintered timber and broken stone. Devereux and his men were thrown to their knees by the concussion, their ears ringing and their vision blurred by dust and smoke that poured through the collapsing floor. In the chaos that followed, Nehemana moved with the fluid speed of a hunting cat, diving through the nearest window in a shower of glass that glittered like falling stars in the afternoon sunlight. She hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact, but managed to keep hold of the camera that contained evidence capable of toppling governments. "Kill her!" Devereux's voice roared from the wreckage above. "Don't let her escape with those photographs." But as his men struggled to reach firing positions, the parade ground erupted with new arrivals who changed the entire tactical situation in an instant. Lakota warriors emerged from the smoke like avenging spirits, their faces painted for war and their weapons gleaming with deadly purpose. But these weren't the desperate remnants of defeated tribes. These were professional soldiers, armed with modern rifles and moving with the coordinated precision of a disciplined military unit. At their head rode a figure that made Nehemana's heart leap with recognition and hope. Chief Joseph Running Wolf, her father's brother, leading 50 warriors who had spent the past month infiltrating the territory disguised as reservation Indians traveling to government-mandated councils. The ultimate deception, hiding in plain sight while they gathered intelligence and prepared for this moment of reckoning. "Nehemana," Running Wolf called out in the Lakota language. "The white soldier speaks truth. This was a trap within a trap. But the spirits favor the righteous, and we have sprung our own surprise." Solomon appeared at that moment, emerging from the smoke near the main gate with his clothes singed and his face blackened by explosions, but very much alive and fighting. Behind him came more warriors, these carrying modern military equipment taken from the defeated supply train guards. The ambush had indeed been a trap, but not the kind Devereux had planned. "The evidence!" Solomon shouted across the chaos of battle. "Did you get the photographs?" Nehemana held up the camera, and even at that distance she could see relief flood across his smoke-stained features. But their victory celebration was premature. From the upper floors of the administrative building, Devereux's men had found firing positions and were beginning to direct coordinated fire at the warriors below. "The building!" Running Wolf shouted in English, his voice carrying the authority of a war chief who had never known defeat. "Burn it all. Let no trace of their corruption survive." What followed was less a battle than a systematic destruction of everything Devereux had built over decades of careful planning. The warriors moved through Fort Randall like a cleansing fire, not targeting innocent soldiers, but focusing their fury on the administrative buildings where the evidence of conspiracy was housed. Documents that couldn't photographed were gathered and burned in great pyres that sent columns of smoke into the clear autumn sky. But Devereux himself had vanished in the chaos, slipping away through secret passages that honeycombed the building like the tunnels of some burrowing parasite. It wasn't until the fighting was nearly over that Solomon spotted the colonel near the fort's rear gate, attempting to escape on horseback with a small group of his most loyal followers. "He's running," Solomon called out, pointing toward the fleeing figures. "We can't let him reach his contacts in Denver." The chase that followed stretched across 20 miles of broken country, through canyons and over ridges that tested both horses and riders to their limits. But Devereux was riding with the desperation of a man who knew that capture meant facing justice for crimes that stretched across decades, while his pursuers were motivated by something stronger than desperation. They were motivated by the need to see justice done for all the innocent blood that had been spilled. The end came at a place the Lakota called Weeping Rock, where a natural spring fed a small pool surrounded by standing stones that had been sacred to the people for countless generations. Devereux's horse had gone lame, forcing him to make his final stand in a place where the spirits of murdered ancestors seemed to gather like storm clouds. "It's over, Colonel," Solomon said. approaching with his rifle ready but not yet aimed. Surrender, and you'll live to stand trial. Keep fighting, and you'll die here like the men you sent to murder innocent families. Devereux stood beside the sacred pool with his uniform torn and his face streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes still burned with the fanatic devotion of a man who believed his cause justified any atrocity. You think you've won something here today. You think destroying one operation will stop what's coming. There are dozens of men like me, hundreds of operations like this one. Cut off one head, and 2 more will take its place. Maybe, Nahimana said, stepping into the circle of stones with the camera still clutched in her hands. But this head will serve as a warning to the others. And these photographs will expose your entire network to the light of justice. Justice? Devereux laughed bitterly. You speak of justice while standing on land stolen from Mexico, built on the graves of tribes that resisted the march of civilization. I am civilization, you savage. I am progress and order and the future that will sweep away every trace of your primitive past. No, Nahimana replied quietly, you are the past. You are the darkness that people like Solomon choose to fight against. You are the corruption that must be burned away before anything clean can grow. The shot that ended Colonel Marcus Devereux's life came not from Solomon's rifle or any weapon carried by the pursuing warriors. It came from Devereux's own hand, a final act of defiance that denied his enemies the satisfaction of seeing him brought to trial. He toppled into the sacred pool, his blood mingling with waters that had run clear for 1,000 years, in the silence that followed. As the echoes of the gunshot faded among the standing stones, Solomon felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Rebecca's death. Not happiness, not peace, but something deeper. The knowledge that he had finally found a purpose worthy of the sacrifices required to achieve it. What happens now? He asked, looking at Nahimana and Running Wolf as they stood beside the pool where justice had finally claimed its due. Now, we develop those photographs, Nahimana replied. We send copies to every newspaper, every honest politician, every federal marshal who might listen. We make sure the world knows what happened here, and we make sure it never happens again. And after that? Nahimana looked at him with eyes that held depths of feeling she had never allowed herself to express during their desperate flight from death and conspiracy. After that, we find out if 2 people who have been through hell together can build something good in the world they fought to save. Solomon Wade had entered Devil's Canyon as a broken widower searching for stolen cattle. He emerged as a man who had found something worth living for, something worth fighting for, something worth the price he had paid to protect it. In the end, perhaps that was justice enough for anyone. The sun was setting over the sacred stones when they finally turned away from Weeping Rock, carrying with them evidence that would topple governments and testimony that would free a people. Behind them, the pool ran red with the blood of a man who had tried to steal the future and found instead that some debts can only be paid in full. The hunt was over. The reckoning was complete. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, 2 souls who had lost everything were finally free to discover what they might build together from the ashes of what they had destroyed.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.